I do see a bit of a dilemma here. I think I'm supposed to stay behind this microphone because you're sending this across to those who weren't able to come, and that's going to be hard on me.
Do you preach with your feet too?
Yeah, I like to wander around and talk to the people. And so, as I do that, I don't know how wide that is.
You got it from like there to the corner, so.
Oh, okay, okay. The microphone is really not needed in an area this size because you could hear me, but it's needed for them. So, a little introduction. Some people ask, who are you? Well, I was born in Cadillac, Michigan, 73 some years ago, and I grew up in Michigan and went to public school for the first 7 years, and I went to Cadillac Church School my 7th grade year, Holland Church School my 8th grade year. Glenn Glass and I were together in Delphinian for my high school times. What year did you graduate, Glenn? With me, okay, okay. You can tell I didn't know about networking and connecting with folks back when I was in college and high school. I had to go to my yearbook to find out who was I with. Although 2 other graduates at 67, I've already been their pastor in other churches where they're elders. It's kind of fun to see us continuing on and working for the church. I was raised on a farm near Tustin, Michigan, and since I've retired, I'm moving back to that farm. I married Bonnie, that's her nickname. We'll get into names soon enough. So her legal name, Yvonne Marie Eli Calkins, but everybody calls her Bonnie. So when she came home from the hospital, this little bundle of joy, her mother looked at her and said, Yvonne's too big a name for you. We'll call you Bonnie. That's been all ever since. Although if you call her Eli, she'll answer to that too. Because all of those Elis, but she has over half a dozen siblings. They'll answer to Eli, all of them will. We've been in ministry for over 50 years. We've been married for over 50 years. 52 now. 53. Because we got married in 7. Yeah, 53. Okay. And we could go through a lot of details, but most of my ministry was done in Kentucky. I spent 43 years in Kentucky with the Kentucky Tennessee Conference. But I've doubled the number of districts that I've pastored and number of churches I've pastored since Michigan has put me into this interim pastoring thing, which is fitting me well. I've been really enjoying this. 4 to 6 months is how long I've been in the previous districts. And as John and I were sharing, sometimes it can go up for a year. Who knows? Now, I wouldn't think this would be a hard district to fill since it's so close to Camp South and everybody loves Camp South. But it's not up to me. And I'll share with you as long as I am able to. Bonnie and I have 4 children. They're all married, and we have 4 grandchildren, one who is deceased. Our oldest daughter, Karen Adiel, is married to Orion Lawrence. And let me tell you, since it does fit into our message of the day, our name that we gave to our oldest daughter, Karen Adiel, is Hebrew names, took on the Old Testament, and it means shining ornament of God. Shining ornament of God. Now, we had no idea what we were setting ourselves up for as we gave such a powerful name to our first, but you can imagine what's coming on. Our next daughter, Jeff the Oren, is married to Robert Campbell, and her name means Jesus is coming, shout for joy. Our first 2 daughters, up until last week, were both missionaries in Asia. Jeff is still a missionary, but she's returned to the States. And brought Bonnie back with her. Bonnie has spent the last 2 months helping out in Laos. So if you read Frontier magazine, the Joella Thea name that's been in there for 15 years, that's our Jeff. Moving on. Aaron Zadok is married to Heather, And Aaron's means enlightened by Christ's righteousness. So we see we were able to keep finding some names that fit together and were logical. Then our last child, Connie Alzamar, is married to Andrew Crone. And our last two both live in the Chattanooga, Kentucky area. But Alzamar means sing praises for God's gracious gift. Now, there's one other member of the family that you don't get to meet yet because Bonnie hasn't been back long enough to get reunited with her service dog, Sienna. But Sienna is a Sanskrit name that means friend. And when you see this Labradoodle, even though she's 70, 75 pounds, she's as loving and caring. She definitely fits that word friend. So that's a little bit about the family, and there's hundreds of stories. Let's get into the message that we get. Let's pray. Gracious Lord, as we open your word, we seek your face. We want to know you. We want to become more like you. We pray that you'll bless us as we study and share today, that we can see Jesus. In his name we pray. Open your Bibles to the book of Daniel, chapter 1. And I have full expectation that I'll be able to give all of you something new out of this first chapter of Daniel. Because I've read all the commentaries that I've been able to get my hands on Daniel, and I've got some tidbits and insights that I think you'll find useful. The light's better over here. Daniel 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Read more about that in Jeremiah 25. Verse 2, and the Lord gave, I underlined that phrase, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Recognize whose hand is involved in this. God is saying to Israel, Judah, Jerusalem, you have thumbed your nose at me long enough, you're in trouble. You have rejected my grace, I can no longer shield you from the troubles that are around. God gave them into his hand. We're seeing the articles in the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. You learn more about that when you get to chapter 3, but we're not there yet. Verse 3, then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles. Now, they were kidnapped. Think about it, and that's not unusual with war. It still happens in war. If you've been reading stories from Africa, you know these kinds of things still happen. And it's not just the boys that get kidnapped. The Africa story happened to be more about girls. But Nebuchadnezzar had a little trick in mind that he would bring these boys into his council, train them. They were mostly teenagers, I think. And after they'd been trained and indoctrinated in the ways of Babylon, he would send them back to their home territory, and they would rule in their area for Babylon because they had become on his side. Very, very slick and effective measure. So Daniel and his buddies got kidnapped and were being trained. Verse 4, they were young men in whom there was no blemish, good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, quick to understand. They had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. I think Daniel may have had to learn 3 new languages, and some of them were not written languages, but the ones that were written tended to be in either cuneiform, which is wedge-shaped symbols, very complex to be able to read in cuneiform, and the others were more a pictographic language. We'll get into verse 5 more next time. The king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. I think of this as a college education he's giving them. Now, verse 6. From among these of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We're going to focus on those 4 today. To them, the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah the name Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Verse 8, that I'm not focusing on today, is the highlight verse of this chapter. If there's one verse in this chapter you memorize, it's verse 8. But we're going to get into the whys of that in our study today. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to change their allegiance from Jehovah, Yahweh, the true God, to him and his gods. And so there are a number of things he did to do that. Bring them to college, give them a free college education. That can sway somebody. Of course, he apparently made them eunuchs. That definitely got their attention. He gave them food. We'll talk about another time. But what we're looking at today, he changed their names from godly names to pagan names, with the thought that he would change their allegiance from the God whom their name mentioned to his own gods. And there were dozens, perhaps even hundreds of gods in that one. Is there anybody here with the name of Daniel?
We have an Azariah.
No. Okay, well, Daniel's a good name. Very powerful name. It means God is my judge. Now, imagine going through life. Now, I told you the names we gave to our children. You go through life with this name that says, I stand before God, and he's looking at everything I'm doing. God is my judge. That's the name Daniel. Powerful name. And I think Daniel acknowledged his name. It's fun to hear our children occasionally talk about how their name has impacted who they are. Daniel knew who he was. He knew he was, God is my judge. I'm living in the face of God, and he's looking at everything I say and do. Read verse 8. He knew who he was. And so Nebuchadnezzar is giving him a new name. And I believe the name that Nebuchadnezzar wanted to give him was Belshazzar. It's easy to recognize when you start studying the linguistics that Belshazzar, which simply means may Bel preserve the king. So it's a name that gives credit to a god named Bel, that he would preserve the king Nebuchadnezzar. So it's a nice prayer if you believe in Bel and if you really want to serve Nebuchadnezzar. But I believe Daniel, and if you've ever learned a second language, it's easy to understand how this can be done. I think he fudged up the name and deliberately mispronounced it and changed it from Belshazzar to Belteshazzar. Move it from a god to a belt. See how silly that becomes? And so when he's given, okay, your name is Belshazzar, and he repeats back, okay, my name is Belteshazzar, and it's good enough. But he's smiling inside, and I believe his cronies, as they call him Belteshazzar, they're laughing because he's got this silly name. But Daniel is knowing, I have resisted this indoctrination that the king's trying to give me. God is my judge. I'm still Daniel. And you'll notice, as you read through the book, Daniel's self-designation, when he talks about himself, he calls himself Daniel. A couple of times the name Belteshazzar comes in there, but Daniel called himself Daniel. I'm convinced of that. Moving on, Hananiah. Hananiah means grace of God. God's grace. I live for God's grace. Is there anybody here named Anna or Hannah? That's a common way of using that. And you may remember our youngest daughter, Haniel. That's related. That's this grace idea. May the grace of God surround me as I live. What a prayer! That's the emphasis on this name, Hananiah. Well, he was given a new name, Shadrach. I think he was given the name Shadrachu. Because as we look at this, remember, I've read a lot of commentaries on this. The Raku would be a moon god that glorifying the moon god Aku. So he was given this name that took from living under the grace of God and the awareness of God's grace in his life to giving credit to the moon or the god of the moon or whatever. And what did he do? Well, he dropped off that last sound, the Ahu, and just made it Shadrach. So here again, we find the name has been buzzed, but anybody who learns a new language at some time will be embarrassed. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. And it can come in the most innocent ways. Story from my second daughter. She spent a year as a teacher, the second language, in Korea. And so she tried to learn Korean. And it's an interesting and difficult challenge to be teaching people to speak one language while you're trying to learn their language. But in Korean, the S sound never fails to have the SH, the H with it. In the Korean language, S does not stand by itself, it's always SH. So she spent 13 months in Korea. She comes back to the States, and she's now working as a teacher, and she tries to tell somebody to sit down. That did not come out. I mean, as soon as it's out, you know, oops. And that's in her mother tongue. But Daniel and his buddies, by pretending they could not understand that language well, and the name that's been applied, they fuzz up the name and make it sound silly. You see, this is passive resistance. They knew what they were doing. I really believe they did. Oh, one more thing while we're on Hananiah. I believe that Hananiah, and we're getting more and more archaeological records from that day and time. And as we study through them, there are some of these scholars that are kind of watching. I believe that Hananiah was the chief of the royal merchants. His job title on Anu, I believe that was who he was. He was the treasurer. Now you say, how can he be treasurer? Well, you think about it. Somebody who's willing to be thrown into the furnace rather than do something that he thinks the king is wrong in telling him to do. His loyalty, his first loyalty is to God, where he says, King, I'll be loyal to you unless you ask me to do something that's against God. He can be trusted with money. He can be trusted with money because he's going to be faithful. This kind of thing has happened in other experiences. You keep reading mission stories, you find exciting things happen to somebody who is willing to be tortured because they're going to be faithful. Somebody's going to look at that and say, they'll be faithful. So that was Hananiah. His buddy Mishael. You know what that is? Anybody here named Michael? Okay, you see? That name means who is like God. That's a powerful name. That's a name that says, I represent God, is what I say and do. It's almost too strong a name to give to anybody, but it's an invitation, and as we recognize what happens in our daily life, my prayer is to represent God correctly. I fail abysmally, but that's my prayer. That's what I seek to do. And by God's grace, I move in that direction. When I get to the application of this message, you'll see how this really fits. Oh, and his name, Meshach or Meshaku, glory to the moon or the sun gods. But as we looked in these archaeological records and we looked for names that might be this same person, Mishal and Marduk, he was the overseer of the slave girls. Now you think about that for a minute. What man are you going to be put in charge
of the slave girls. Better choose carefully. A manly principle. A manly principle. I believe that's who he was. They were safe with him. He protected them. And Azariah. Azariah means Yahweh has helped. And God is helping me. But Azariah goes through life fully aware that God is taking care of me. That I am living under the shadow of God's love. Azariah. God is helping me. And he's given this name, I believe it was a bit Nebo. And you catch the change from the G and the B. And when you're learning to pronounce the words in another language, often enough, there's similar but different ways of saying. A baby is learning to talk, has about 70 or 80 different sounds that we make. But then we systemize them, and in each language that we learn, there are only 30 or 40 that are used in any particular language. So there's languages where there's clicks as part of the word. And camp meeting a year and a half ago, I met a lady from Southern Africa, and I said, "Oh, yeah," because I could tell she has a little bit of an accent. And I said, "There's a language in Africa that uses clicks. I think it's named Xhosa, but you have to say with the K. It's a click Xhosa, and I can't click as part of the word. But oh yeah." And so she said, "Give me a sentence in Xhosa." And we use the clicks in fun, but we don't use it as part of our English language. There's dozens of these sounds that are part of it. So as you're learning a different language, it's easy to bleed over and say one of the sounds that you grew up with rather than the sound that's new in that language. And it may be difficult to learn that. Especially my missionary children are having some very interesting challenges with learning the languages. And it's great. So Abednego called himself Abednego, and he was not faithful to Nabu. He was not faithful to that false god, which that name you'll find is a part of the Nebuchadnezzar name. And what job did he get? I believe he was secretary to the crown prince, Abel Marduk, who you'll find sometimes spelled in the Bible as evil Marduk, but the word evil has connotations that we know. So I go with the A-M-E-L rather than E-B-I-L. When you move from one language to another in transliteration rate, it's always gets complicated. But I believe that this crown prince, son of Nebuchadnezzar, that he was the secretary for, he served as king of Babylon for 2 years. One of the first things he did as king, and he was a weak king, he couldn't endure, things didn't go well under his watch. But he's the king who freed Jehoiachin when he ascended the throne. So I can't help but think that some influence from his secretary made a difference. He says, "Yeah, sure, I'll free the king and feed him at my table for the rest of his life." I do wonder what their fellow classmates call them. I think they use the silly names. I think among themselves they used the silly names when they were in public and the personal, godly names when they were in private. And I agree with that attitude. If you want to make fun of me and it brings glory to God, I'm just going to move on. And I will not let it bother me if you're laughing at me to the glory of God. We had to keep our priorities straight. Now, I told you there's an application to this. We looked at the names of Daniel and his buddies, and we talked just a little bit about your names. We each have names. You have a family name. And children get raised with the phrase, "Don't embarrass your family by your behavior." We got a family name, and we don't want it to be maligned by your foolishness. You also have a given name. And every name has a meaning. There is benefit in finding out, why do you have that name? Well, my parents, on a whim. Well, what was the whim? My parents named me after my daddy. That's pretty simple and straightforward. My daddy was a good, upstanding citizen, and he was treasurer of the Cadillac Church for decades. He had a little trick as treasurer. If the church budget was going well, was in the black, he would wear a blue or a black tie. If the budget was in the red, he'd be sporting a red tie. And so, calling for the offering, he would look and say, "Jim, oh yeah, there he is. He's wearing a red tie today. We need you to dig deep." So, yeah, I don't have any idea at this time what the finances are in this church, but I do know that God is glorified by our generosity to Him. You cannot give God. So, I'm named after my dad, and I'm proud to be named after my dad. It's fairly sobering to go through the cemetery and see my name on that tombstone. But I'm named after my daddy. Now, he used the first name, as you might have caught, and I used my middle name, Fred. So he used the F and I used the J. So we divided up. You also have a name that's Christian. You're going around town and you're saying, "I am a Christian." Are you? Are you? It's really a serious question, because God's cause has been much more damaged by those who say they are Christians and are not than it has been by the infidels who never darken the door of the church. By the grace of God, we can live up to that. Now, because the name Christian has been so maligned, if you watch any movies, and I am not a movie watcher or even television watcher, praise God, Bonnie, when we got married, said, "We're not going to have a television in the home," and we haven't. And that's been more of a blessing for me than it has been for her. But it was a decision that came largely from her. But I can easily be sucked into this trash and useless and waste of time stuff. And even the news is a waste of time most of the time, to be truthful about it. What do they put on the news but stuff that sells and brings in more advertising? By the grace of God, we need to focus on Him. So what's been promulgated around the world with this name Christian has markedly misrepresented Jesus. And Muslims particularly are upset with this word Christian because Christians are considered to be adulterous, what's being portrayed on the screen. They're portrayed to be alcoholics, what's being portrayed as normal Christian behavior, and alcohol is not shunned by way too many Christians. Even the eating of the pigs. The Bible says don't, but people calling themselves Christians make excuses and do, and the Muslims look at that and say, "I don't want to have anything to do with Christians." So we as Seventh-day Adventists in our mission work have often called ourselves Adventists rather than Christian. Our presenting name, who are you? I'm an Adventist. Well, what does that mean? Every name has meaning. As an Adventist, that means I'm looking forward to the coming of Jesus. Are you? What is the focus in your life? Is it prepare day by day, myself and those in my circle, to be ready to welcome the Lord when He comes? You take the name, now let's live the name. And as I drove in, I was commenting, do you care how your name is spelled? Yeah, my wife's name Bonnie is spelled with a Y, B-O-N-N-Y, and we care about that. I care about it more than she does. So I correct people when it's misspelled. So our Seventh-day Adventist name, the S is capitalized. There's a hyphen after the 7 before the day. The day is not capitalized. I know the Seventh-day Baptist capitalize the day, but we in our official words don't capitalize it. And then, I know, you're picking up the bulletin and finding, oops! Yeah, it's so easy. And for years, I thought it would be more appropriate to spell it with a capital D. Well, it's not a question of what's appropriate, it's how is our name spelled? And I know even on the sign, it's not right. And that's going to be very expensive to correct that. So just recognize the embarrassment that we're not representing our name quite correctly. When I write a check to the church, I write Seventh-day Adventist, and I very carefully, I don't capitalize that D anymore. And the Adventist, the A is capitalizing the Adventist. If you need to abbreviate your name, SDA is not an agreed upon appropriate abbreviation. Now you'll find it's used a lot, but it adds confusion in the world. There's a lot of people who don't know the difference between an SDA and an LDS. What's LDS? Oh, that is and we have some similarities. We both have a strong teaching on family and a message on health. So there's some similarities, but we're not them. We're us. We're Adventists. The name Adventist is the official abbreviation for our full name, Seventh-day Adventist. And there are times when it's appropriate to use an abbreviation. This time when Bonnie needs to sign the name of Bonnie M. Calkins. But most of the time, and if you're ever writing a check to her, you can write it Bonnie Calkins and it catches perfectly well. But there are times when we're signing a deed on the house, we use the full legal name. While we're on this, some of you have names that you're not so very proud of. It's okay to change your name. Yes, I've been called for most of my life, but now I want to be called, and you give a new name. And we knew a lady up in South Dakota that she lived in 4 different areas in her life. And in each area, she used a different part of her first and middle name. And so she had 4. If somebody calls her on the phone and says hi and gives her name, she would know where they were from. She would identify the era of her life where they were because she had those 4 different names. A friend of ours was called Joyce for decades. But then, as they retired and as they moved, she said, you know, I'd really like to be called Joy rather than Joyce. Shorten the name a little bit, but it gives a different focus. Now, I know that the name Joyce can mean the joy, but she wanted the joy to be the focus. And she's a very lovely and happy person. Which is your name? Is it spoken with respect? Do people recognize that you are a member of this congregation living for the glory of God? Daniel and his buddies had to make that choice. Whatever they did, wherever they went, they knew they were representing God, and they wanted to live for his glory. So should we. That's the takeaway from this. May I live day by day, moment by moment, for the glory of God. We've chosen a hymn in closing. Hymn number 100, that's an easy hymn. And great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever wilt be. Hymn number 100. We will stand together as we sing.